Hi, this is Krista at The Secret Yarnery. Welcome to our Erigeneia Cal, Part 4, the border. So excited! So it's a long video. I filmed every single start and every single tip of the shawl and every single end of each row. So I'm with you pretty much the whole way. We're doing the chart again. And if you do have a clover hook, for the love of all that is worthy, please go and get it now. Because I did about 6 rows with my tulip, which I love, don't get me wrong. But my yarn was splitting and I was like, oh, it's the yarn, you know, this natural cotton. It's woven very loosely. Got a clover, blasted through every puff stitch. So, like, it's insane. Like, you'll see me struggling for like 7 rows or 6 rows, and then the shawl's finished because I changed to clover. So change to clover now. If you don't have a clover or you want to get a clover, I'll leave a link in the description box below. If you do click on it, you can buy anything at Amazon at all, and a small, tiny, a few pennies go towards Secret Yarnery. So, and it's the same price for you. It's literally still just Amazon. So that would be appreciated if you are in the market for a new hook or anything else. So, border time! Can't wait! So to do the border, this is the same chart that is on Ravelry. I've just cut each row separate and divided it. So this is row 1. And we're looking for our circles again, and there is a chain 6 to start. So I'm going to join the color I'm using for my trim just into that last stitch where we ended. If you're not changing colors, just wait for me a sec while I join mine. So I've joined my yarn and we're ready to do our chain 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Pull my tail down. Alright. Now into the next double crochet, we're making a double crochet, and we're doing that for the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 double crochets. So we're making 7 double crochets into the next 7 double crochets below, not into the first treble. So not into that one where we normally start. We're jumping over to the next one and doing 1 double crochet into the next 7 stitches. There's 1. This is 2, 3, 4, 5, there's my tail, 6, and 7. My stitches looked a bit different because I'm going over my tail. I've woven in the coral color tail. Now it says to chain 2 and skip 2. Okay, chain 2, 1 and 2, skip 2, and into the third we're going to make a puff stitch with 3 pulls of the yarn, because it has 3 strands to make that puff. So to make a puff stitch, wrap your yarn like you're doing a double crochet into the third stitch, put your hook in, grab your yarn and bring it back, and just pull that loop up, or pull your hook up so your loop is the same size as the one underneath. So that's 1. We're going to do that again. 2, and again, wrap your yarn, go in, grab your yarn and bring it back, and pull it up to the side. So that is the forming of the puff. Now we're going to wrap our yarn and take off all those loops. 2 loops left on your hook, and chain 1, or is that a single crochet? I wonder what you call that actually. Well, do that anyway. Chain 2, skip 2, and 7 double crochets into your previous work. So into the 3rd double crochet you make a double crochet, and into the next 6 double crochets as well, for a total of 7. And 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes. Chain 2, 1 and 2. We're going to skip 2, and into the 3rd we're going to make another puff stitch. So wrap your yarn into the 3rd stitch, put your hook in, grab your yarn and bring it back and pull it up to the side, or pull it over to the side. And again for our 2nd, that's number 2, and again for our 3rd. And wrap your yarn, take off all your loops, 2 loops left, and finish that off. Chain 2. Now we're going to do our 7 double crochets again, starting in the 3rd stitch. And 7. Chain 2, 1, 2. Wrap your yarn into the 3rd stitch, make a puff stitch with 3 going in 3 times. So 1, 2, 3. Wrap your yarn, take off all those loops. Wrap your yarn, take off the last 2 loops. Chain 2. Into the 3rd stitch, do your 7 double crochets, and just repeat this all the way down to the tip of your shawl, and I'll meet you there. Getting close to the tip of the shawl, so I've done my puff, I've done my chain 2, so just keep going till you reach the end. I'm going to do my 7 double crochets, and 7, chain 2, 1, 2, like usual, skip 2. So now we're just going to go straight into this corner space. That's the tip of our shawl, and we're going to do 3 puff stitches with a chain 1 in between, all into that space. So wrap your yarn, go in, grab your yarn, bring it back, pull it up. It's 1, 2, 3. Take them all off. Finish the puff stitch, chain 1, and 1 more puff stitch. 2, 3. Oh, my yarn. It's splitty. There we go. Finish the puff, chain 1, and 1 last puff stitch into that space. Pull up once, pull up twice, pull up 3 times, take off those loops, finish the puff stitch. Now it says chain 2, skip 2, and do your 7 going back. So chain 2, let me turn my shawl a bit, skip 2, 1, 2, and 7 double crochets going back. So now we're doing the same thing down this side, and I'll meet you at the end. If your pattern is off a little bit and you don't get, the tip of your shawl isn't lining up perfectly, how you can kind of fudge it is adjust these ones. You don't have to skip 2. Maybe you could just skip 1, and down here you don't have to skip 2, but you do need to keep your 7. So make sure you have your 7, and you can adjust how many stitches you're skipping if your pattern is a bit off and you don't want to frog. Oops, we're doing just like how we did, and hopefully it lines up right at the end of our shawl. So it's 1 and 7. Yay! That was nerve-wracking. If yours is off a bit, you can always adjust these last guys on this side too, if you have to. Hopefully you don't. And then our chart says chain 2 and treble crochet into the top of the chain 4. So chain 2, 1 and 2, and treble crochet into the top of the chain 4. Oh, that was a double. Treble, wrap your yarn twice. 1, 2, 3. Great. So that is row 1 finished. Row 2, look for your chains. which are over here now, it says chain 2 and do a puff of 2 more wraps. So your chain 2 counts as your first wrap for your puff stitch. Chain 2 and 1 more puff stitch all into the top of that treble. So let's do that together. So chain 2, 1, 2, turn your work. We're working into this very first stitch like we always have been. So wrap your yarn and go into that stitch, grab your yarn, bring it back, pull it up, and again wrap your yarn, go in, grab your yarn, pull it up. So that finishes this puff stitch. Wrap your yarn, take off those loops, and finish your puff stitch, and chain 2, 1 and 2, and 1 more puff stitch into the same spot. 1, 2, 3 wraps. Finish it off and chain 2, it says. 1 and 2. Now we're going to be working in between these double crochets. So it's going to turn into little pyramids. So that's kind of easy because you don't totally have to count. You're just going to go over and you're going to go into that space between those 2 double crochets. Put your hook in and you're making your double crochet in that space. So there's 1 double crochet and 6. So see, we went in between the spaces. So now that's where we're going to be making our double crochets for the trim. Now we're going to follow the pattern going back. So we did our 6 double crochets in between the double crochets from the previous row. Chain 2. Let's do that. A puff stitch, a chain 2, and a puff stitch all into the top of the other puff stitch. Okay, so wrap your yarn, go into that stitch. So you're just going into the top of that puff. And you're going to make 2 puffs. So 1 wrap, 2 wraps, 3 wraps. Finish your puff, chain 2, and 1 more puff into the same space, the same stitch. 1, 2, 3 wraps. Take all those off. Finish your puff. Oh, I'm snagging my yarn. Okay. Chain 2, 1, 2, and now we're doing the same thing. We're doing our 6 double crochets into these spaces. So let's do that. Into the space between the double crochets of the previous round. And 6. And we're going to keep doing this repeat all the way down your shawl until we get to the corner. So chain 2. Oops. My yarn is running out here. So we're going to make 2 puff stitches into the top of this puff stitch, that stitch that we did to finish it off. So wrap your yarn, make your first puff, 2, 3, finish that one, chain 2, 1 and 2, and 1 more puff into the same stitch. 1, 2, 3 wraps of our yarn. Finish that puff, chain 2. So keep going all the way to the tip of the shawl. You're doing the same pattern repeat. 6 double crochets in between the double crochets of the previous row, chain 2, puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch, all into the top of the puff stitch of the previous round. Chain 2, 6 double crochets in between the double crochets of the previous round, and I will meet you when we get to do the tip of the shawl. So when you get to the tip of your shawl, I'm here. So I finished my 6 double crochets. I've done my chain 2. Now into the top of each cluster, you're going to do puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch, chain 2, and then into the next puff stitch. So each puff stitch gets 2 puff stitches with a chain 2 in between. So wrap your yarn and go into the top of that stitch. Grab your yarn and bring it back and pull it up. So you need your 3 loops. That's 2, 3. Wrap your yarn, take off your loops, and finish your puff stitch, chain 2, and now wrap your yarn again into the same stitch. We're making 1 more puff stitch. 2 loops, 3 loops, chain 2, and into the top of the next puff stitch we're doing the same thing. So into the top of that stitch, 1 loop, 2 loops, 3 loops, chain 2, and into the same stitch, 1 more puff stitch. 1, 2, 3 loops, chain 2. So it looks like that so far. So into the next puff stitch we need to make 2 puff stitches. 1 loop, 2 loops, 3 loops, finish the puff, chain 2, 1 more puff into the same stitch, 1 loop, 2 loops, 3 loops, finish your puff, and then chain 2, and we do our 6 double crochets in between the previous double crochets. So chain 2, and now you're going to work your way back doing the same as you were before. So that's what the tip of your shawl looks like after row 2 of your border. So keep going, and I will meet you when you get to the end of this row. When you get to the end of row 2, it says chain 2 like usual, and then into the top of the chain 4. So skip 2 chains, and into the top of the chain 4 we're going to do puff stitch, chain 2, and a puff stitch. So this is the top of our double crochet, and then if we turn our chain, so there's our double crochet, the first chain, the second chain. So into this third chain, wrap your yarn and go into there. So you're going to make 2 puff stitches. So there's our first puff stitch, chain 2, and into the same spot our second puff stitch. And that is the end of row 2. That's all it tells us to do. So now we're finished with that one. Row 3 is here. Row 3. So look for our circles, which are over here. And there's a lot of them. There is 7. So we're going to start with a chain 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Turn your work. Now into the chain 2 space, we're going to do puff stitch, chain 2, and puff stitch. So that's a bit easier because it's just into the space. So wrap your yarn, and you'll want to hold that wrap on your hook so it doesn't mess you up. And then do your puff stitch. 1, 2, 3 wraps. Take those off. Finish your puff stitch. Chain 2. And 1 more puff stitch into the same spot. 1, 2, 3. Finish your puff stitch. Then it says chain 3. 1, 2, and 3. And now 5 double crochets in between the double crochets of the previous row. So that's easy enough. And 5. Chain 3. 1, 2, and 3. And now we're going to do puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch into the chain 2 space in between those other puff stitches. So that's what we're going to be doing all the way along. 1 wrap, 2 wraps, 3 wraps. Oops, split me yarn. There we go. Finish that puff. It's a bit of a fight. Chain 2, 1 and 2, and your second puff stitch, oops, and your second puff stitch into the same space. 2, 3 wraps. Finish it off. Chain 3, 1, 2, and 3. Now we're going to be doing our 5 double crochets in between the double crochets of the previous row. And 5, chain 3, 1, 2, 3. And now our puff stitches in this chain 2 space of our other puff stitches. So that is your pattern repeat for this row. I will meet you when we get to the tip of the shawl and we will do this part together. So now our chart tells us to do our chain 3 and into the space between the pair of puff stitches to make 1 more pair. So puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch, chain 3, 1 into the top, 1 pair. So puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch, chain 3, and another pair into this pair underneath. So let's do it. So I finished these 5 double crochets. So now it's saying to chain 3. Oh, those birds are loud. 1, 2, and 3. And puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch into the chain 2 space between that pair of puffs. So puff stitch, chain 2, and another puff stitch into the same space. And a chain 3, 1, 2, and 3. And puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch into the center of the next pair. So those birds. Into the very tip of your shawl. That guy. So puff stitch. Chain 2, puff stitch, so that finishes this one. Chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch into this into the center of that next pair. So into this pair there, we're building another pair. Puff stitch, chain 2, one more puff stitch into that same space, chain 3, and now we're working our way back. So this part is the exact same as this other side. Chain 3 and our 5 double crochets in between those double crochets of the previous row. So just keep going, doing this repeat. So this is what the tip of the shawl looks like at row 3. So you have your 3 pairs just separated here, and now we're going to work our way back, making it look like this all the way down this side, and I'll meet you at the end of the row. So when you get close to the end of your row, check what you're supposed to do. So after the 5 double crochet we just finished, so chain 3 and put a pair of puff stitches in the center of the previous pair. So chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and then right into here we're going to do 2 puff stitches. 2, 3, oops, there we go. So there's our first puff stitch, chain 2, and 1 more puff stitch. Then it says chain 3 and put a treble crochet into the top of the last puff stitch you made of the previous row. So chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and let's look for that top of the stitch, that guy right there. So treble crochet, so wrap your yarn twice, go into the top 2 loops of that V on your hook, and make 1 treble crochet to finish row 3 of your border, for your edging. So that is the end of row 3. Row 4, let's look for our circles. They're on this side. And it says, we have to chain a lot. So 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have to chain 7 to get over to our puff stitches again. So let's chain 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Turn your work, or part of your work, it's pretty big already, into the center of the previous pair. You're going to make another pair. So puff stitch, chain 2, and puff stitch. 2, 3 wraps, and finish your stitch. Chain 2 and 1 more puff stitch into the same space. Now it says to chain 4 and then 4 double crochet and chain 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now in between these double crochets we're going to do 4 double crochets. Easy peasy. And 4. And now chain 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And make your pair. So puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch into the center of these guys. 1, 2, 3 wraps. Chain 2. Second one into the same space. 3 wraps. And chain 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 double crochets in between the double crochets of the previous row, and 4, chain 4, 2, 3, 4, and now we're going to make our puff stitches into this spot, that space, and this is our repeat for this row. Out of the way. 4 double crochet, chain 4, puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch, chain 4, 4 double crochet, chain 4, puff stitch. So you're going to go all the way along this side, and I will meet you at the tip of your shawl and we will do this beautifulness. So I've done this last 4 double crochets, so now we're going to chain 4 to get closer to our corner. 1, 2, 3, and 4, and puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch into the center of the previous pair. So puff stitch, chain 2, and 1 more puff stitch into the same space. Chain 3, 1, 2, 3, 1 puff stitch pair into the center of the very bottom, so that's down here. So 1 pair into here. Puff. Chain 2, 1 more puff into the same space. Chain 3, 1, 2, 3. Turn our work a tiny bit. 1 pair into this previous pair, which is now over here. This one. 1, 2, 3. Chain 2. 1 more puff into the same space. 2, 3 wraps, and chain 4, and then we're just doing our repeat back down the side. And this is the tip of your shawl at the end of row 4. So keep going down and I will meet you at the end of this row. When you get to the end of row 4, I've done this last 2 puff stitches with a chain 2, that last pair here, and now we just have this thing left here, the chains down below. So it says to chain 4 and treble crochet into the top of the previous chain 4. So chain 4, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And treble crochet, so wrap your yarn twice and into the 4th chain, 1, 2, 3, and 4, treble crochet. That's good. So that is the end of row 4 of our trim. Row 5, look for our circles, our chains. So there's a chain 3 and then a double crochet into the same stitch, the top of that treble from the previous row. So let's chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and turn our work. And now double crochet right into that first stitch like we always do, usually do, not always. Double crochet into that first stitch and then chain 3 Okay, 1, 2, 3, and now we're going to do a puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch, all into the chain 2 space in between this pair on the previous row. So now instead of doing 2 puff stitches, we're going to do sets of 3 puff stitches. So into that one we'll do our first puff, 2, 3 wraps of yarn, chain 2, the second puff stitch, chain 2, and the third puff stitch. You can slide these back so you have space in your chain 2 area. Give those a push back. 1, 2, and 3. Ooh, lost it. 1, 2, and 3. There we go. And chain 3, and then 3 double crochets in between those stitches. So chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and 3 double crochet in between the double crochet of the previous row, 2 and 3, chain 3, and we do it again. We make another cluster of 3. So now we are figuring out what we need to do. 1, 2, 3 chains, and into the next, in the space between the next pair of puff stitches, we are going to do a set of 3 puff stitches. Chain 2, 2, 3, chain 2, push those back a little bit just to make sure you have room for another puff stitch, and we'll do our last puff stitch into the same space, and chain 3 and do our 3 double crochets again. 1, 2, 3, and into the space, 3 double crochets. 1, 2, and 3. So this is our repeat for this round. 3 double crochets, a chain 3, and 3 puffs. Chain 2 in between. So this is how we're going to be going along this row, and I'll meet you when we get to go do this tip. I've finished my last set of 3 double crochets along the side, and I've gotten to the tip of my shawl. So we are going to do the chain 3, which I did, and now a set of 3 puff stitches into the next pair of puff stitches. So 1 puff. Oh, and yes, I changed hooks. A chain 2 in between and another puff. I was really splitting my yarn, and I thought, let me just try my clover instead of my tulip. And so much easier. So if you have splitting yarn, go grab your clover. And your last puff. 1, 2, 3. Oh, it's just gliding through like butter. And then a chain 3. 1, 2, 3, and another set of 3 puff stitches separated by a chain 2 into this top or center pair. So let's do 3 into there. 2, 3 wraps, chain 2, 1 more puff, 1, 2, 3 wraps, chain 2, and our last one into the same spot. You can push your stitches back if you need more space. Chain 3 to get down, and we're going to do 3 into this pair over here, which is this guy, is that guy, like that. So we'll do 3 puffs, 1, 2, 3, chain 2 in between, second one, 3 wraps, chain 2, and our last puff, and chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and now we're going back along this side. So 3 double crochets in between the previous double crochets, 1, 2, and 3. And this is what your tip looks like for row 5 when row 5 is finished. So now you're going to keep going down, doing the same repeat, and I'll meet you at the tip. At the end of the row, I've done my last set of 3 puff stitches there. So I just have my weird chain left. And it says chain 3 and then make 2 double crochets into the top of the chain 3. So we can do that. Chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and double crochet into the top of the chain 3. So we're skipping 4 chains along this side, and we're going to the third one up. So 1, 2, 3. Into the third chain, 2 double crochets. So 1 double crochet and into the same stitch, your second double crochet. So that finishes row 5. Row 6 is here. So for row 6, it says chain 3 and 1 double crochet in between those double crochets below. So into the space, because see how that it's lined up in the center? So that means in the middle. So let's start with our chain 3. 1, 2, 3, and turn your work. My yarn sorted out. So we're going to be making a double crochet into that space. So we did our chain 3, now we're going to do our double crochet into that space. And chain 3, 1, 2, 3. In between the first 2 puff stitches of our set of 3 into that space, we're going to be making a puff stitch, a chain 2, and a puff stitch into here. So into this space right there. Puff stitch, chain 2, and another puff stitch into the same spot. Chain 3 to get to the next space, 1, 2, 3, and 2 puff stitches with a chain 2 in between in the next space. So first puff stitch, and chain 2 and 1 more puff stitch into the same space. 1, 2, 3 wraps. Take off your loops, close your puff stitch, and chain 3. 1, 2, 3, and 2 double crochet into the center of our double crochets from the previous row. First double crochet, second double crochet, chain 3, and now we're going to repeat that. Chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and now into this first space in between the first 2 puff stitches, we're going to do puff stitch, chain 2, and a puff stitch. Chain 3, 1, 2, 3, to get to this little spot here, and into that one we're doing the same thing, so puff stitch, chain 2, and 1 more puff stitch. Chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and 2 double crochets in between those double crochets from the previous row. First and second. Chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and now you're back to making your sets of puff stitches in between there. So this is how this row is going to look. So you're doing a set of puff stitches, a chain 3, and a set of puff stitches in between those spots of your set of your 3 clusters from down below, or your cluster of 3 puff stitches. And then chain 3s and 2 double crochets. 2 double crochets, put that over there. So keep doing this all the way down, and I'll meet you when we get to the tip of the shawl. We're going to be working out this beauty. So we're at the tip of the shawl. I've done the first set of 3. It's the same as everywhere else. There's nothing new. And now we're at the very tip, which is up here. What we're going to do different is to get from this cluster to over here, we're only doing a chain 2. So chain 2, and then clusters into this, well, not clusters, puff stitches into this tip. Same as we're always doing on this whole row. Chain 2 in between and 1 more puff stitch into the same space. Chain 3 to get around, so that's the same. 1, 2, 3, and puff stitch 2, like a set of puff stitches into this space over here. So 1. I'm so glad I changed hooks. Chain 2, and into the same spot, 1 more puff stitch. 3. Oh. Chain 2, 1 and 2. Now, cheek cheek. Going back along this side, we did our chain 2, so now we're going to build our clusters into this one here, which is still from the center. We're in that center area, the tip of our shawl. So regular into here, and we're just going to keep working our way back. And this is how the tip of your shawl looks after row 6. So keep going all the way that way, and I will meet you at the end of this row. So I've done the chain 3. Now there's a double crochet. It looks like it's into the space between. So I'm just going to go into that space in between the chain 3 and the double crochet of the row below and make 1 double crochet, and then a double crochet into the top of the chain 3. 1, so count your V's, 1, 2, and 3, just at the top. I want 2 loops on my hook of any sort. There we go. So double crochet. So that finishes row 6. Row 7, our last row, so exciting. So look for the little circles, the chain stitches, which are on this side, and we're gonna do a chain 3. So chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and turn your work, or some of your work, it's so big now. So I've done my chain 3. We're skipping all this big chunk here. We're just going to be working in between these puff stitches. So jump straight over and make a puff stitch, a chain 2, and a puff stitch in between the first 2 puff stitches of the row below. So your first puff stitch, chain 2, and 1 more puff stitch into the same spot. And in between all of these puff stitches, there's just chain 2. So we'll chain 2, and into the next space, in between the next 2 puff stitches, we're going to do 3 puff stitches, all with a chain 2 in between. So here's our first puff stitch, chain 2, our second puff stitch into the same space, chain 2, and our third puff stitch into the same space. You can push those stitches over if you need more space to get them to line up right onto that chain. Chain 2, and into the next space we're doing puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch. One and 2, and 1 more puff stitch into the same space. So we finished this shell of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 puff stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 puff stitches. And now we're just going to jump, not chaining. We're going to make a double crochet into the center of these 2 double crochets. This little guy here, we jump right over from our puff stitch to make our double. So that'll pin down our edge. So keep some tension on your hook. You want this to be nice and pulled over. You can see that. Okay. Now we're going to jump straight from that double crochet to make our next 7 puff stitches into this section coming up. So the first one gets 2 puff stitches with a chain 2 in between. Chain 2, 1 more puff stitch into the same space, chain 2, into this space, the next spot between the puff stitches, 3 puff stitches separated by a chain 2 in between each. So there's our first puff stitch, chain 2, second puff stitch, chain 2. You can push those stitches over a little bit so you have a spot to build your next puff stitch. This is the third one, and chain 2, and into this last space between the puff stitches, 2 puff stitches separated by a chain 2. Here's our first one, chain 2, our second one, and now we've done our 7 puff stitches into that area. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So now we're going to jump straight over and make a double crochet in this spot there. So get your yarn nice, your tension nice, and double crochet straight in between those 2 double crochets of the row below. And that just pulls down those puff stitches into a nice shape. And you're going to continue doing this all the way along your side. So from here we're going to go and start building our puff stitches into our next kind of shell area. So 2 into the first, 3 into the middle, and 2 into the last, all separated by a chain 2. So I've reached the tip of the shawl. So in between these clusters, there's no chain 2. So we're just going straight from this puff stitch to the puff stitches on this side over here. So 1, 3 wraps, 1 puff stitch, chain 2, 1 more puff stitch in the same spot, chain 2, 3 puff stitches in the next space over, chain 2, 2nd puff stitch, chain 2, 3rd puff stitch, chain 2, and now into this last spot, puff stitch, chain 2, puff stitch, now no chaining now. Now we're going to jump over and do these puff stitches here. So jump over straight, our first puff stitch into the first space in between. Now we're going into these, we're making our double crochets, so no chaining, just 1 double crochet into that space. And now we're going to continue working all the way back, doing our puff stitches into our little shell areas and our double crochet into the space. So this is what the tip of your shawl looks like after row 7. So keep going and I'll meet you when you get to the end of this row. So I've finished the last series of puff stitches and we just have this little bit left on the side. So let's check our chart to find the bit where we end, and it just says go straight from the puff stitch and make a double crochet in the space, because that double crochet is in between. It doesn't line up on top, it lines up in between the double crochet and the chain of the previous round. So let's do that. Jump straight over and make a double crochet into that space. I'm making a small double crochet. You want to have a bit of tension because you don't want big loops on the very end of your shawl. And that's it. We're finished. So chain 1, cut your yarn, leaving a long enough bit to sew in with a needle. Pull your hook up and your yarn through and tug that down. to secure. So now you can go ahead and sew that in, and you finished your shawl. So I hope you really enjoyed this cowl. It was so fun working on it with you. Thanks for everybody who joined our Facebook group. I loved seeing all your pictures. If you're late and not doing it with us right now, don't worry about it. Everything is still up on the Facebook group. You can always start it. You can always work on it. We're happy to share our tips and tricks. And thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this cowl or my other videos, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Thanks for watching. Stay hooked. So it is very big. You see it? This is Krista at The Secret Yarnery. Welcome to our Erigeneia cowl part 4, border time. So I'll just show you my ends. Oh, I'm supposed to hide those. Okay, anyway, I'm sewing in the ends today, but I wanted you to have the video sooner than later, so yes, I have to do my ends. Oh, sorry about that.